Imagine you are sitting alone at 2 in the morning, your phone screen glowing in the middle of a dark room. Not because you cannot sleep, but because you keep scrolling endlessly through videos, stories, and posts of people living lives that seem more complete than yours. And somewhere inside you, there is something you cannot name. Not quite sadness, not quite anger, but a strange hollowness, as if you are looking into someone else's party through a foggy glass window, knowing you could walk in, yet unable to understand why your feet refuse to move. You are not someone who lacks intelligence. You know that. You read widely. You understand concepts that many people your age have never even encountered. You can analyze social dynamics, recognize when your emotions are being manipulated, and name your own psychological defense mechanisms. But all of that understanding has not made you feel better. It has not made Monday mornings any lighter. It has not filled the void you cannot locate a beginning or an end to. And that is what is truly unsettling, is it not? Not the not knowing, but the knowing everything and still not being okay. Your generation is called Gen Z, but generational labels never say what matters most. They do not talk about the night you realized you had no idea what you actually wanted. They do not talk about the strange exhaustion that shows up even when you have not done anything at all. They do not talk about the loneliness that exists right in the middle of a conversation with friends, when you are laughing and at the same time feeling like you are watching yourself from the outside, like a stranger observing a play where you are the main character but have no right to rewrite the script. Something is happening to this generation at a level deeper than what people usually discuss. And if you stay until the end of this video, I think you will find an answer you did not know you were looking for. Sartre said something in the middle of the 20th century, in a world that had no smartphones, no social media, no algorithms recommending content based on your anxieties. He said that human beings are condemned to be free. That was not a hopeful statement. He was not celebrating freedom. He was describing a burden when you can choose anything, become anyone, follow any path. Then every choice is simultaneously the death of countless other choices. And in the space between all those possibilities, anxiety is born. Kierkegaard called this feeling the dizziness of freedom. Now try to imagine growing up with that feeling, but multiplied by 1,000 through the internet, through social media, through a world where every morning you wake up and see hundreds of possible versions of your own life being lived by other people. A classmate from 9th grade is now building a startup in Singapore. Someone you have never met in person is traveling across South America with a laptop and a look of total freedom. Someone your exact age just published their first book. Gen Z does not just hear about these things through the news. They are submerged in it, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from the time they were 13 and 14 years old, and still forming their very concept of who they are. That sounds like opportunity. But what does psychology call it? Barry Schwartz, a behavioral psychologist, named this phenomenon the paradox of choice. He demonstrated that the more options people have, the less happy they become and the more paralyzed. They grow more anxious before every decision, and after choosing, they feel more regret because they cannot stop wondering whether the other option would have been better. If you only have 2 paths, you choose and you move. But if you have 2 million paths and you can see other people walking most of them at the same time, you stop choosing altogether. You stand still and freeze. But that is not the real problem. That is only the surface. The real problem goes deeper, and it connects to what philosophy calls the central question of existence. Who are you when no one is watching? Think about this for a moment. When was the last time you did something without any part of your mind, imagining how it would look as a caption? When was the last time you had an emotion without immediately trying to translate it into language, to share, or to explain to someone else? And when was the last time you felt certain about your own identity without needing someone else to reflect it back to you? This is the heart of Gen Z psychology, and it cuts deeper than any label people put on this generation. Let us talk about the first psychological mechanism, what I call the mirror cognition trap. Erik Erikson, a developmental psychologist, described adolescence and young adulthood as the period when a person must resolve the identity crisis. Who am I, and what will I become? That is a normal and necessary task of growing up. But Erikson did not have in mind a world where every 15-year-old would begin working through that crisis, not in silence or through real relationships, but on a public platform driven by likes, shares, and comments from strangers. When you build your identity under the public eye, what happens is that you are not actually building an identity. You are building a character. And slowly, the boundary between the character and the real person blurs to the point where you no longer know which one is real. You begin to measure your self-worth through metrics, through feedback, through external validation. And every time that validation does not come, or comes and then disappears, you do not just feel disappointed. You feel like you do not exist quite enough. An identity built on other people's mirrors is the most fragile identity there is. The second mechanism is what I want to call the paradox of knowledge. Recent research points to something strange about Gen Z. They are the generation with the highest psychological literacy in recorded human history. They know about attachment theory, trauma responses, and cognitive distortions. They can recognize when they are feeling anxious and name the exact type of anxiety they are experiencing. They understand when their parents have unresolved issues, when their friends are being manipulative, when society is projecting unhealthy expectations onto them. And none of that understanding has made them feel better. Why? Because knowing and healing are two different paths, and people tend to confuse them for one. There is an image I want you to hold. A person sinking in deep water who knows the precise name of every current pulling them down. He can recite everything about hydrodynamics. He can describe every physical force acting on his body, but he is still sinking. Because swimming is not knowledge about water. Swimming is actual movement through water. Gen Z grew up with an enormous library of psychological knowledge, but inside an environment where the actual practice of healing, meaning deep connection, silence, patience with oneself, and tolerance for uncertainty, has been steadily replaced by short-form entertainment and constant stimulation. They know they are sinking. They just never learned to swim. And here is the third mechanism, the one I think is the most painful: the exhaustion of continuous performance. Data from GWI in 2024 showed that 80% of Gen Z felt lonely in the past year, compared to only 45% of baby boomers. But statistics cannot capture what is actually happening, because this kind of loneliness is not about lacking people around you. Gen Z is the most connected generation in history. They can text 20 people at once, join online communities spanning the entire globe, and may have never truly sat alone in a physical sense. And yet they are still lonely. Because digital connection, no matter how wide, is missing the one element every human relationship requires: unconditional presence. When you are with someone in a real space, without screens, without the pressure to be interesting or to present yourself in a particular way, your brain receives a safety signal at the neurobiological level. Oxytocin is released. Your autonomic nervous system settles, but the majority of Gen Z's interactions happen inside an environment where you are always in a state of semi-performance. You never truly power down. And the brain cannot distinguish between being with a real person and performing to be accepted. It only knows it has never been allowed to actually rest. Then wonder why you feel tired without knowing why you are tired. Do you feel like something is clicking into place right now? Do you recognize yourself in what I just described? And more importantly, have you ever considered that the exhaustion you feel is not a weakness of yours, but a completely rational response from a nervous system trying to survive inside an environment it was never built to handle? And if that is true, then what you need is not more effort. What you need is something entirely different. But before we get there, let us look directly at the most painful part. At the true peak of all of this, there is a phenomenon that psychologists studying Gen Z have begun to call identity collapse under performance pressure. And it works like this. You construct a version of yourself that you believe is good enough to be accepted. You are careful, you observe. You learn to present yourself in ways that the people around you respond to positively. And gradually, you become skilled at being that person. But here is the cruelest trap in the entire process. One day, you look in the mirror and do not recognize the person looking back. Have you ever woken up and felt like you were playing a role in your own life? Do you know the feeling of saying the right things, in the right places, with the right people, and still feeling like you are standing in the wings of your own story? Have you ever asked yourself, underneath all the layers of image you have constructed, what is left that is actually you? And the most terrifying question of all, if tomorrow everyone who knows the version of you that you perform for simply disappeared, would you still know who you are? That is the peak of the crisis. Not a lack of success, not a lack of connection, but a lack of self. And from this point, everything begins to shift in a different direction. The first thing I want to tell you is not a tip or a technique. It is a fundamental shift in how you see. You need to learn the difference between understanding yourself and observing yourself. Gen Z is extraordinarily skilled at self-observation. They can examine every emotional reaction they have with near clinical precision. But observation is not understanding. Observation is standing outside and describing. Understanding is being inside and feeling, without needing to immediately encode it into language. Why does this matter? Because when you are constantly observing yourself, you are creating distance between you and yourself. Every time you are about to cry and then think, interesting, I am having an attachment response. Every time you are about to feel angry and then analyze the origin of that anger before allowing yourself to actually feel it, you are becoming more sophisticated and at the same time more estranged from who you are. Your body is speaking a language, and you are translating it before you have even listened. Think of the image of a river. When you stand on the bank and watch the current, you can describe it accurately. But you will never know how cold the water is, how strong the pull is, until you step in. Healing does not happen on the bank. It happens in the water. The question to sit with is this. In the past week, how many times did you allow yourself to actually feel an emotion all the way through, without analyzing it, without sharing it, without turning it into content inside your own mind? The second principle is what I call the practice of deliberate imperfection. This is not about intentionally doing things badly. It is about creating spaces in your life where outcomes simply do not matter. The digital environment contains no such spaces. Everything can be recorded, stored, and evaluated. The real test of your psychological health is not how well you perform in the things you are already good at. It is whether you can do things you are bad at and keep doing them without needing to feel ashamed. The reason this works psychologically is that it rebuilds your connection to the process rather than the outcome. When you only do things you are already skilled at, or things that can be presented well, you are continuously anchoring your identity to achievement. And an identity built on achievement collapses with every failure. But when you draw badly, learn music slowly, read slower than others, and keep doing it quietly and alone, without posting it anywhere. You are practicing the most important thing of all, existing for yourself, not for anyone else. Can you remember something you used to love before smartphones existed? Something no one else knew you were doing. The third principle is about how you relate to being alone. Most of us spend enormous energy running from solitude because we confuse it with isolation. But they are completely different things. Isolation is the absence of connection with others when you need it. Solitude in the deeper sense, what philosophers like Rilke called true aloneness, is the space where you return to yourself. Not to escape the world, but to remember that you exist independently of it. Gen Z, a generation that is never truly alone because there is always a screen nearby, is missing this most fundamental psychological nutrient. When the brain is never given time in what neuroscientists call the default mode network, meaning the state of rest and free wandering without external stimulation, it cannot integrate memories, cannot process accumulated emotions, and cannot create a continuous sense of self. You feel fragmented not because something is wrong with you, but because your brain has never been allowed to reassemble its own pieces. If this video is saying something you have felt for a long time, but never known how to put into words, I want to invite you to share it in the comments below, not to drive views, but because sometimes simply finding language for what you feel is already the beginning of something. And if you want to keep exploring ideas like this channel will be here. The fourth principle, and perhaps the most counterintuitive, let go of the project of building yourself and begin the project of discovering yourself. There is a subtle but profound difference between the two. Building yourself assumes that a better version of you is waiting to be constructed, and your job is to continuously optimize, improve, and upgrade. Discovering yourself assumes the opposite, that what you are looking for is already there, and your job is to remove the layers that are not yours in order to see it. Gen Z lives inside the heaviest self-improvement culture in human history. But the paradox is this: you cannot improve what you do not yet know you actually are. When you build yourself based on other people's images, you are not becoming better. You are becoming more like someone else, and every step you take in that direction is a step away from the only version of yourself you could ever authentically become. Ask yourself honestly, just once, how much of what you are working toward is genuinely yours, and how much of it is something you saw someone else want and decided you wanted too because it seemed like the right answer. Now, I want to tell you the final thing, the thing I have been holding back through this entire video, everything we have talked about, the identity crisis, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the pressure to perform, the paradox of choice, and the paradox of knowledge. All of it has a name that goes deeper, and that name is not pathology. It is not a weakness of a generation. It is not the consequence of spending too much time on your phone. Its name is this: genuinely living through a genuinely difficult moment that no one has ever been adequately prepared to handle. Every generation before this one had something that anchored them to a clearer sense of self: religion, geographic community, trades passed from parent to child, grand narratives of meaning that no one questioned because the question itself did not exist in their culture. Gen Z is the first generation that has had to answer the question, "Who am I?" entirely on its own, inside a world that has lost all of those anchors, while simultaneously being bombarded by 1 million possible answers every single day. And here is the final paradox, the thing I want you to carry with you after this video ends. The crisis is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are awake enough to recognize you have not found the answer yet, and only the people with enough courage to live inside the question, without running, without pretending, without numbing themselves with content or with busyness, have any chance of finding something real. You do not need to have figured it out. You only need to stop pretending that you have. The exhaustion you feel is not the end point. It is the beginning of something different. And the fact that you are here, sitting with this question instead of scrolling past it, is already braver than you think. Breathe out. You do not have to be anyone else tonight.